Birch Browsings by John Burroughs, Chapter 6, from Wake Robin. The region of which I am about to speak lies in the southern part of the state of New York, and comprises parts of 3 counties, Ulster, Sullivan, and Delaware. It is drained by tributaries of both the Hudson and Delaware, and next to the Adirondack section, contains more wild land than any other tract in the state. The mountains which traverse it and impart to it its severe northern climate belong properly to the Catskill Range. On some maps of the state they are called the Pine Mountains, though with obvious local impropriety, as pine, so far as I have observed, is nowhere found upon them. Birch Mountains would be a more characteristic name, as on their summits birch is the prevailing tree. They are the natural home of the black and yellow birch, which grow here to unusual size. On their sides beech and maple abound, while mantling their lower slopes and darkening the valleys, hemlock formerly enticed the lumberman and tanner. Except in remote or inaccessible localities, the latter tree is now almost never found. In Shandaken and along the Esopus, it is about the only product the country yielded, or is likely to yield. Tanneries by the score have arisen and flourished upon the bark, and some of them still remain. Passing through that region the present season, I saw that the few patches of hemlock that still lingered high up on the sides of the mountains were being felled and peeled, the fresh white boles or the trees just stripped of their bark being visible a long distance. Among these mountains there are no sharp peaks or abrupt declivities, as in a volcanic region, but long uniform ranges heavily timbered to their summits, and delighting the eye with vast undulating horizon lines. Looking south from the heights about the head of the Delaware, one sees 20 miles away a continual succession of blue ranges, one behind the other. If a few large trees are missing on the skyline, one can see the break a long distance off. Approaching this region from the Hudson River side, you cross a rough, rolling stretch of country, skirting the base of the Catskills, which from a point near Saugerties sweep inland. After a drive of a few hours, you are within the shadow of a high, bold mountain which forms a sort of butt end to this part of the range, and which is simply called High Point. To the east and southeast it slopes down rapidly to the plain and looks defiantly toward the Hudson, 20 miles distant. In the rear of it, and radiating from it west and northwest, are numerous smaller ranges, backing up, as it were, the haughty chief. From this point through to Pennsylvania, a distance of nearly 100 miles, stretches the tract of which I speak. It is a belt of country from 20 to 30 miles wide, bleak and wild, and but sparsely settled. The traveler on the New York and Erie Railroad gets a glimpse of it. Many cold, rapid trout streams, which flow to all points of the compass, have their source in the small lakes and copious mountain springs of this region. The names of some of them are Millbrook, Dry Brook, Willie-Wee-Mac, Beaver Kill, Elk, Bush Kill, Panther Kill, Neversink, Big Injun, and Calicoon. Beaver Kill is the main outlet on the west. It joins the Delaware in the wilds of Hancock. The Neversink lays open the region to the south, and also joins the Delaware. To the east, various kills unite with the Big Injun to form the Esopus, which flows into the Hudson. Dry Brook and Millbrook, both famous trout streams from 12 to 15 miles long, find their way into the Delaware. The east, or Pipacton, branch of the Delaware itself takes its rise near here in a deep pass between the mountains. I have many times drunk at a copious spring by the roadside, where the infant river rises first sees the light. A few yards beyond the water flows the other way, directing its course through the Bear Kill and Schoharie Kill into the Mohawk. Such game and wild animals as still linger in the state are found in this region. Bears occasionally make havoc among the sheep. The clearings at the head of a valley are oftenest the scene of their depredations. Wild pigeons in immense numbers used to breed regularly in the valley of the Big Injun and about the head of the Neversink. The treetops for miles were full of their nests, while the going and coming of the old birds kept up a constant din. But the gunners soon got wind of it, and from far and near were wont to pour in during the spring, and to slaughter both old and young. This practice soon had the effect of driving the pigeons all away, and now only a few pairs breed in these woods. Deer are still met with, though they are becoming scarcer every year. Last winter, near 70 head were killed on the Beaver Kill alone. I heard of one wretch who, finding the deer snowbound, walked up to them on his snowshoes, and one morning before breakfast slaughtered 6, leaving their carcasses where they fell. There are traditions of persons having been smitten blind or senseless when about to commit some heinous offense, but the fact that this villain escaped without some such visitation throws discredit on all stories. The great attraction, however, of this region is the brook trout, with which the streams and lakes abound. The water is of excessive coldness, the thermometer indicating 45 degrees in the springs and 47 in the smaller streams. The trout are generally small, but in the more remote branches their number is very great. In such localities the fish are quite black, but in the lakes they are of a luster and brilliancy impossible to describe. These waters have been much visited of late years by fishing parties, and the name of the Beaver Kill is now a potent name among New York sportsmen. One lake in the wilds of Callicoon abounds in a peculiar species of white sucker, which is of excellent quality. It is taken only in spring during the spawning season, at the time when the leaves are as big as a chipmunk's ear. The fish run up the small streams and inlets beginning at nightfall and continuing till the channel is literally packed with them and every inch of space is occupied. The fishermen pounce upon them at such times and scoop them up by the bushel, usually wading right into the living mass and landing the fish with their hands. A small party will often secure in this manner a wagon load of fish. Certain conditions of the weather, as a warm south or southwest wind, are considered most favorable for the fish to run. Though familiar all my life with the outskirts of this region, I have only twice dipped into its wilder portions. Once, in 1860, a friend and myself traced the Beaver Kill to its source and encamped by Balsam Lake. A cold and protracted rainstorm coming on, we were obliged to leave the woods before we were ready. Neither of us will soon forget the tramp by an unknown route over the mountains, encumbered as we were with 100 other and one superfluities, which we had foolishly brought along to solace ourselves with in the woods, nor that halt on the summit where we cooked and ate our fish in the drizzling rain, nor again that rude log house with its sweet hospitality, which we reached just at nightfall on Mill Brook. In 1868, a party of 3 of us set out for a brief trouting excursion to a body of water called Thomas's Lake, situated in the same chain of mountains. On the excursion, more particularly than on any other I have ever undertaken, I was taught how poor an Indian I should make, and what a ridiculous figure of a party of men may cut in the woods when the way is uncertain and the mountains high. We left our team at a farmhouse near the head of Millbrook one June afternoon, and with knapsacks on our shoulders struck into the woods at the base of the mountain. Hoping to cross the range that intervened between us and the lake by sunset, we engaged a good-natured but rather indolent young man who happened to be stopping at the house and who had carried a knapsack in the Union armies to pilot us a couple of miles into the woods so as to guard against any mistakes at the outset. It seemed the easiest thing in the world to find the lake. The lay of the land was so simple, according to accounts, that I felt sure I could go it in the dark. "Go up this little brook to its source on the side of the mountain," they said. "The valley that contains the lake heads directly on the other side." What could be easier? But on a little further inquiry, they said we should bear well to the left. When we reached the top of the mountain, this opened the doors again. Bearing well to the left was an uncertain performance in strange woods. We might bear so well to the left that it would bring us ill. But why bear to the left at all, if the lake was directly opposite? Well, not quite opposite, a little to the left. There were 2 or 3 other valleys that headed in near there. We could easily find the right one, but to make assurance doubly sure, we engaged a guide, as stated, to give us a good start and go with us beyond the bearing to the left point. He had been to the lake the winter before and knew the way. Our course, the first half hour, was along an obscure wood road which had been used for drawing ash logs off mountain in winter. There was some hemlock, but more maple and birch. The woods were dense and free from underbrush, the ascent gradual. Most of the way we kept the voice of the creek in our ear on the right. I approached it once and found it swarming with trout. The water was as cold as one ever need wish. After a while the ascent grew steeper. The creek became a mere rill that issued from beneath loose moss-covered rocks and stones, and with much labor and puffing we drew ourselves up the rugged declivity. Every mountain has its steepest point, which is usually near the summit, in keeping, I suppose, with the providence that makes the darkest hour just before day. It is steep, steeper, steepest, till you emerge on the smooth, level, or gently rounded space at the top, which the old ice gods polished off so long ago. We found this mountain had a hollow in its back when the ground was soft and swampy. Some gigantic ferns which we passed through came nearly to our shoulders. We passed also several patches of swamp honeysuckles red with blossoms. Our guide at length paused on a big rock where the land began to dip down the other way, and concluded that he had gone far enough and that we would now have no difficulty finding lake. "It must lie right down there," he said, pointing with his hand, but it was plain that he was not quite sure in his own mind. He had several times wavered in his course, and had shown considerable embarrassment when bearing to the left across the summit. Still we thought little of it. We were full of confidence, and bidding him adieu, plunged down the mountainside, following a spring run that we had no doubt left to the lake. In these woods, which had a southeastern exposure, I first began to notice the wood thrush. In coming up the other side, I had not seen a feather of any kind or heard a note. Now the golden trillidy of the wood thrush sounded through the silent woods. While looking for a fishpole about halfway down the mountain, I saw a thrush's nest in a little sapling about 10 feet from the ground. After continuing our descent till our only guide, the spring run, became quite a trout brook, and its tiny murmur a loud brawl, we began to peer anxiously through the leaves for a glimpse of the lake, or from some conformation of the land that would indicate its proximity. An object which we vaguely discerned in looking under the near trees and over the more distant ones proved, on further inspection, to be a patch of plowed ground. Presently we made out a burnt fallow near it. This was a wet blanket to our enthusiasm. No lake, no sport, no trout for supper that night. The rather indolent young man had either played us a trick or, as seemed more likely, had missed the way. We were particularly anxious to be at the lake between sundown and dark, as at that time the trout jumped most freely. Pushing on, we soon emerged into a stumpy field at the head of a steep valley which swept around toward the west. About 200 rods below us was a rude log house with smoke issuing from the chimney. A boy came out and moved toward the spring with a pail in his hand. We shouted to him, when he turned and ran back into the house without pausing to reply. In a moment the whole family hastily rushed into the yard and turned their faces toward us. If we had come down their chimney, they could not have seemed more astonished. Not making out what they said, I went down to the house and learned to my chagrin that we were still on the Mill Brook side, having crossed only a spur of the mountain. We had not borne sufficiently to the left, so the main range, which at the point of crossing suddenly breaks off to the southeast, still intervened between us and the lake. We were about 5 miles as the water runs from the point of starting and over 2 from the lake. We must go directly back to the top of the range where the guide had left us, and then, by keeping well to the left, we would soon come to a line of marked trees which would lead us to the lake. So turning upon our trail, we doggedly began the work of undoing what we had just done. In all cases a disagreeable task, in this case a very laborious one also. It was after sunset when we turned back, and before we had got halfway up the mountain, it began to be quite dark. We were often obliged to rest our packs against the trees and take breath, which made our progress slow. Finally, a halt was called beside an immense flat rock which had paused on its side down the mountain, and we were prepared to encamp for the night. A fire was built on the rock cleared off, a small ration of bread served out, our accoutrements hung up out of the way of the hedgehogs that were supposed to infest the locality, and then we disposed ourselves for sleep. If the owls or porcupines, and I think I heard one of the latter in the middle of the night, reconnoitered our camp, they saw a buffalo robe spread upon a rock with 3 old felt hats arranged on one side and 3 pairs of sorry-looking cowhide boots protruding from the other. When we lay down, there was apparently not a mosquito in the woods, but the Noseeums, as Thoreau's Indian aptly named the midges, soon found us out, and after the fire had gone down, annoyed us very much. My hands and wrists suddenly began to smart and itch in a most uncomfortable manner. My first thought was that they had been poisoned in some way. Then the smarting extended to my neck and face, even to my scalp, while I began to suspect what was the matter. So wrapping myself up more thoroughly and stowing my hands away as best I could, I tried to sleep, being some time behind my companions who appeared not to mind the Noseeums. I was further annoyed by some little irregularity on my side of the couch. The chambermaid had not beaten it up so well. One huge lump refused to be mollified, and each attempt to adapt it up some natural hollow in my own body brought only a moment's relief. But at last I got the better of this also and slept. Late in the night I woke up, just in time to hear a golden-crowned thrush sing in a tree nearby. It sang as loud and cheerily as at midday, and I thought myself, after all, quite in luck. Birds occasionally sing at night, just as the cock crows. I have heard the harebird and the note of the kingbird and the ruffed grouse frequently drums at night. At the first faint signs of a day, a wood thrush sang, a few rods below us. Then, after a little delay, as the gray light began to grow around, thrushes broke out in full song in all parts of the woods. I thought I had never heard before them sing so sweetly, such a leisurely golden chant. It consoled us for all we had undergone. It was the first thing in order. The worms were safe till after the mid-morning chorus. I judged that the birds roosted but a few feet from the ground. In fact, a bird in all cases roosts where it builds, and the wood thrush occupies, as it were, the first story of the woods. There is something singular about the distribution of the wood thrushes. At an earlier stage of my observations, I should have been much surprised at finding them in the woods. Indeed, I had stated in print on 2 occasions that the wood thrush was not found in the higher lands of the Catskills, but that the hermit thrush and the veery or Wilson's thrush were common. It turns out that the statement is only half true. The wood thrush is found also, but is much more rare and secluded in its habit than either of the others, being seen only during the breeding season on remote mountains, and then only on the eastern and southern slopes. I have never yet in this region found the bird spending the season in the near and familiar woods, which is directly contrary to observations I have made in other parts of the state. So different are the habits of birds in different localities. As soon as it was fairly light, we were up and ready to resume our march. A small bit of bread and butter and a swallow or two of whiskey was all we had for breakfast this morning. Our supply of each was very limited, and we were anxious to save a little of both to relieve the diet of trout to which we looked forward. At an early hour we reached the rock where we had parted with the guide and looked around us into the dense, trackless woods with many misgivings. To strike out now on our own hook, where the way was so blind, and after the experience we had just had, was a step not to be carelessly taken. The tops of these mountains are so broad, and a short distance in the woods seems so far, that one is by no means master of the situation after reaching the summit, and then there are so many spurs and offshoots and changes of direction, added to the impossibility of making any generalization by the aid of the eye, that therefore one is aware of it, he is very wide of the mark. I remembered now that a young farmer of my acquaintance had told me how he had made a long day's march through the heart of this region without path or guide of any kind, and had hit his mark squarely. He had been bark peeling in Callicoon, a famous country for bark peeling, and having got enough of it, he desired to reach his home on Dry Brook without making the usual circuitous journey between the two places. To do this necessitated a march of 10 or 12 miles across several ranges of mountains and through an unbroken forest, a hazardous undertaking in which no one would join him. Even the old hunters who were familiar with the ground dissuaded him and predicted the failure of his enterprise. But having made up his mind, he possessed himself thoroughly of the topography of the country from the aforesaid hunters, shouldered his axe, and set out, holding a straight course through the woods and turning aside for neither swamp, streams, nor mountains. When he paused to rest, he would mark some object ahead of him with his eye, in order that on getting up again he might not deviate from his course. His directors had told him of a hunter's cabin about midway on his route, which if he struck he might be sure he was right. About noon this cabin was reached, and at sunset he emerged at the head of Dry Brook. After looking in vain for the line